53 years ago, in the year 1952, Dr. Hans Arnold made a very brief visit to Salt Lake. He never got to Provo. We're delighted that he could find his way from Salt Lake to Provo for this brief lecture here 53 years later. Dr. Arnold's had a long and illustrious career working for the German Foreign Office, which is the equivalent of our State Department's Foreign Service. He, over those years, has helped define U.S. and German relations. He's had wide international experience, having served as the German ambassador to The Hague in Holland for 4 years, having served as German ambassador for another 4 years, to Rome for the ambassador to Italy. He spent 4 years, as I understand it correctly, serving in the U.S. Embassy in Washington, has been the German ambassador to the United Nations in Vienna. Many of you, excuse me, I pardon the slip. In Geneva, I'm sorry, I'm confusing, looking at my notes. He's has been a frequent contributor to newspapers and to magazines. Has a number of books to his credit. Most recently, one of which, Security for Europe, which he co-edited, Europe to be Thought Anew, Why and How Much Further Unification, and How Much Unification Does Europe Need? He will be speaking that to us today. His announced topic is Europe and the United States. Where do we go from here? But he has such a wide background that if he detoured slightly from that, I'm sure none of us would object. We had a fascinating conversation last night in the car about the possibility of Turkey ever entering the European Union. Now, that may come up in the second hour, because when this hour is over, we would invite any who speak German to stay for another 45 minutes for a question and answer session to be conducted in German. So anything that you don't have time to ask about at the end of this hour, if you speak German, can be asked in the session that follows this one. Will you join me in welcoming Dr. Arnold here?
Mr. President, thank you, James, for the wonderful and warm words of welcome. All the more as I have now really good news to start with what is to be said about the transatlantic relations in our days. If I look back, and I have witnessed these relations ever since World War II, and even closer, and having been engaged in this topic since I had been in the Foreign Service, I can't remember a situation which was so difficult, or in which our relations were so much in disarray as they are now, or have been now, for a small couple of years. What I'm saying is, of course, has nothing to do with German government or Germany. I have been speaking for my country. I've represented my country for many, many years, but ever since I have retired from that profession, I'm the only one who is responsible for me. So I'm only speaking for myself. And as this is so, I would like to make the only quote I'm going to make this morning as far as the actual state of the transatlantic relations is concerned. I wouldn't like to limit that to my personal opinion, and therefore I would read to you the first few lines of last year's review made by the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I'm not sure that whether everybody knows what that is. This fund was founded a couple of years ago, and it was made with German money, and meant as a kind of a token of gratitude of the German people for the Marshall Plan fund we have received immediately after World War II from the United States. And I personally was one of them who has received that aid, and it was, I can tell you, very welcome. And this fund is made for improving mutual understanding between Europeans and Americans. And among his efforts is a yearly review on the opinion on either side of the Atlantic, made in a very, very thorough, scientific way, not such a thing as you have within 8 hours, everybody knows what people mean. No, it's very closely personal interviews and so forth. And last year's key findings start with this summarizing lines which I would like to get as a starting point for our considerations. It reads, after the intense debate and disagreements of past 3 years, the transatlantic community is divided. While Americans and Europeans have similar threat perceptions, they differ markedly on how best to deal with these threats and under what aegis. One result of this division is that many Europeans, while wanting to cooperate with the United States, also want to play a more independent role in the world. By contrast, Americans seek a closer partnership with a strong European Union, even if it would not always agree with U.S. perceptions or prescriptions. However, as in past years, Europeans are ambivalent about what kind of global role they should play and at what cost. If these conditions are permanent, they promise to fundamentally transform the nature of transatlantic relations. So I can add, this is in compliance with my personal opinion, but it is a more, as I said, authoritative opinion. And if we look at this year's review has come out a couple of weeks ago and was made in mid-year of 2004. You see that Europeans and Americans as a whole think by 1/5 of those asked that relations have improved, and 3/4 believe they are the same or they are even worse than they were before. And I should mention that they were asked with reference to the efforts by President Bush to improve European-American relations. You may remember that he had been in Europe in the first half of this year and has met also with the German Chancellor Schröder in Mainz for a talk. And as far as the foreign policy of the administration, and that's the last quote I take, is concerned, in the United States, people agree with American foreign policy by 50-50, pro and con, mid of that year. And the Europeans approve the American foreign policy by 24% and disapprove it by 70%. So you will see I didn't exaggerate when I said I never have experienced such a difficult moment in my life. Now, if we want to look at our relations, it would be a serious approach to depart from all those things who are dear to us, our common historical background, our common values, the cultural links and exchanges, and the economic basis which is common. We are practically both the leaders of world economy and all that. But I think that for that, everybody would need more than the time which is available to me. So therefore, I would take up a word of my at one time boss and longtime friend Willy Brandt, who said at one moment when there was talk about security policy and the other aspects of foreign affairs, he said, security is not everything, but without security, everything is nothing. And therefore, I feel it's not only because security problems are in the foreground of public interest at the moment, it's also perhaps a way to have a general assessment of American-European relations. And let us recall what they were for the over 40 years during the Cold War, when we had a relationship as close as never before. And that's exactly what we should keep in mind. What we had in that period of the Cold War, of the bipolar confrontation of the Western and the Eastern Bloc, that was something really extraordinary in history, and it never has happened before. And I'm wondering whether such a thing could happen again, as it had under these very peculiar circumstances, that two peoples or two continents or two groupings of peoples over the distance of roughly 4,000 miles have had such a close relationship in the field of common security. And let us recall that this situation, this long time, was initiated by the United States, by two new initiatives of the United States by which they put a new tone into international relations after they had joined World War II, and by that definitely and permanently world affairs as a later on super, and today as it is called, hyper power. These two initiatives were the foundation of the United Nations Organization and of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, of UN and NATO. Both came about on American initiative. The texts for the treaties were drafted by American drafters. The policy to realize these two projects was American, and Great Britain went along all the way, so we might call it, if you want, also an Anglo-Saxon project. And this was a new way to approach international affairs, by which the United States left behind their what you might call traditional approach to international topics, a approach which went back to the first President Washington, who had warned, as you know, of entangling alliances, and a policy that followed that was a combination of partly pulling back to isolationism, partly moving out to interventionism. A policy which I always have to explain to my fellow Germans is a natural thing for a state that is at the same time a continent surrounded by the seas, with only two neighbors who are pleasant neighbors, and not as we are used in Europe, fighting neighbors over hundreds of years. And so this is nothing to reproach to, you see. But in Europe, people feel that shouldn't be so. But I take it that this was the natural thing, and the American initiative went over that limit. And not with just another treaty, but with an aim that was meant to get far into the future. If you read the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations, and I'm sure everybody among you will be reminded of the two basic documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. That was the same language. It was an aim to bring peace in a new way to the world, and NATO was founded immediately after some events which showed the aggressiveness of the communist Soviet bloc, among others the blockade of West Berlin, which was countered by a gigantic American airlift. There were a few others participating, but if you would have taken out the American planes of that lift, there would occasionally have been a plane coming to Berlin. So it was an American enterprise, it was an American policy, which is still not, if you go to Berlin, you'll see that, it's still not forgotten by the Berliners and by the German. And what was the basis of this new alliance? It was a combination of two interests. It was first the interest of the United States to have a build-up to defend themselves. And part of that was the wish that the western part of Europe should not fall into the hands of the communist enemy. And on the other hand, the Europeans had the interest of having the United States being the main defender of or for them, because this was the only possibility to have a security vis-à-vis that block of power. So this alliance, this relationship was from the beginning based on a strong inequality in security policy. And I could now go on and explain to you how this inequality, from the first moment when the strategy was that a violation of the borderline of the territory of NATO would have the consequences that NATO would hit back with everything that was available, including nuclear weapons, to the point when medium-range ballistic missiles were stationed in Germany that could reach Moscow, whilst Moscow could reach the American sanctuarium, as it was called, only by long-range missiles. I'm not going further into that topic. I know that's dangerous for me because in the 60s I was the man in charge, the desk officer at the Foreign Office, to deal with these questions when NATO changed the strategy, and I had to draft the positions. I had to analyze, was the first one to analyze everything that came in. So, you're easily carried away if you get to such a topic. But and I only mention it not to revive old discussions about security and alliances, only to say that in spite of that great inequality, the alliance kept. We were all very happy with it, and there was no alternative. And we all know now the alliance was successful. Which way and how, that's a matter for scholars to find out. But anyhow, NATO was successful. But on the political side, there was, and the scissor was perhaps the building of the Berlin Wall in '61, that we in the West felt we should do something about the situation. I mean, the static character of the situation did not add to security. You know, in the balance of terror between the two great nuclear powers, which faced each other according to the rule, he who shoots first dies second, because each time had enough material to kill the other side after having been destroyed before. So at this moment came in what I already had mentioned, my old friend Willy Brandt. Became mayor of Berlin, and it happened that we met for the first time in '58 when he came over here on American soil, and it was a good meeting. But Willy Brandt tried, as you know, what later on was called also in international, in other languages, Ostpolitik. And I mention it here to say that what he did, was done with American assistance, even on American wish. I remember a meeting between Brandt and the then Foreign Secretary Dean Rusk, and Rusk urged Brandt, who at that time was Minister of Foreign Affairs, rushed him, and he said, we must try to make the war transparent. And that was the aim, to avoid that the two blocks are too much like two hard rocks faced with each other. And that led to the Ostpolitik and to its three important results: the German-Soviet, the German-Polish, and the German-German treaty. Things went on. The Cold War was over. The West had won it. And the West could have said, mission accomplished. Let's go home. NATO is not necessary anymore. And if you remember, at that time, there were great initiatives to have build up a zone of security between Vancouver and Vladivostok. Everybody was optimistic, but there was an American initiative by then Secretary of Foreign Affairs William Baker, taken in Berlin near the wall a few days after the wall were down, because he was by coincidence in Berlin at that time. And he suggested that we should change NATO into a new NATO with the aim to fight as a common task of the states, the member states of NATO, to fight terrorism, the spread of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, the illegal trade with weapons, and to secure the access of our countries to natural resources necessary for our economy. And a few other topics were mentioned. But the treaty was not changed because there was, and I think it was justified, the fear that a change of the NATO treaty would not be ratified in every NATO country. And therefore we had a policy which was based on mutual declaration, big summit meetings, one of them in Washington at the time when NATO had become 40 years and all that, but had no real legal power to bind the states. And so this fight against terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, to my observation, did not really get off the ground effectively. But NATO went on, until 9/11 happened. And this was the first time in the 50 years of NATO history that NATO, the NATO Council, the member states of NATO in common decided that this was an attack against one of the member states. And by that, the other member states were, according to Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, obliged to do everything in their possibilities to assist, to help this one NATO state. I should add that this was not a routine decision or assessment, because NATO was meant and was done as an alliance against attacks from other states. It was not meant an alliance against an attack that came out of the dark, and nobody could really identify it from where, geographically speaking, it came. So it was a state organization within the international community of states. But anyhow, there was the readiness, and there was the answer from Washington: no, thank you, we don't need NATO. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Wolfowitz, at that time, illustrated that point when he said the alliance cannot decide the actions, the necessary actions decide the alliances. And this was a 180-degree basic change of American policy. You know all the rest, the building up of alliances of the willing and so forth. And for me personally, and I'm not the only one who is a convinced European and at the same time a convinced Atlanticist, you have heard what life I had. This was, well, I may say it was the greatest deception I have experienced in international developments which I'm interested in. So this is the new situation we have to deal with. And now I feel you would ask, yes, and what is Europe to do? What are they doing, and so forth? What is our partner like? And so I would like to put in a few points for the understanding of what the European Union is and can and cannot do. And again, I concentrate on the topic security, because, and this is a little difficult, because the European Union has started as an economic project and still is over 90% an economic and societal project, and foreign affairs and security are an addition to it. So what was the motive for the 6 founding nations to do that? There were 4 motives. First, to get over the traditional enmities within Europe, among them the 6 as a start, that have characterized European internal relations. I come back to that because that was the most important aim. Then there was an urge to get together vis-à-vis the big danger from the East. There was an interest to have a common voice, to develop what was called at that time and ever since a European identity within the West Bloc, within NATO, in front of the superpower United States, a project which not really was up to today successful. And the 4th motive was to improve prosperity in each one of the member state countries. So that was the way we started, and the cooperation we have goes far beyond what we have in international organizations or even in strong alliances like NATO, which I had mentioned. It is a new way to unite not only governments for a certain purpose, but the peoples of Europe in a long-term process. It's not a project which was planned and then one started to execute the plan. It is a process which, ups and downs that goes ahead. And as an example, I would like to mention only one procedure which is typical and different to international alliances and other organizations. That is the way to decide, to vote within the Council of the European Union, which is the assembly of the member states. In the near future we are 27, now 25, Romania and Bulgaria being at the door, and in principle it is decided that they should come in, so we shall be 27 for sure in the short while. And this procedure to decide is applied not in foreign affairs and security, but in that core field, the main field of cooperation economically, and as far as the society, the individuals are social security, posts of labor and so on are concerned in the societal field. And that runs this way. The whole of the Council has 482 votes available that are distributed to each of the member states. Germany, the biggest state, has 29, and Luxembourg, the smallest of the founding states, has 6 votes. So you see, 82 million and 400,000 inhabitants are divided by a difference from 29 to 6. It's clear the European Union, the system of the European Union favors the smaller states at the cost of the bigger ones. All the rest of the distribution is that way. Now, you need 73% of these 482 votes to have a majority. But you don't have it yet, unless you have at the same time the simple majority of the member states of the European Union, which in the case of 27 evidently is 14. And still you are not at the end of your voting, because these 14 states that rally 73% of the weighted votes have to represent at least 62% of the population of the entire European Union. You see, what looks as a somewhat cumbersome and difficult way to vote, if you're used to it, you're not going into the room and say, let's vote. Everything is prepared, and we need one more state if we want that. We are only 13, you see. So that is prepared like in the United Nations and in the American Congress. I mean, that is everywhere the same thing. So, but I mention it to show that this is a union that has not in mind to be something quickly formed for a certain purpose, and if the purpose is disappeared, we go somewhere else. No, this is the way to unite Europe in a solid way. I personally would not say forever, because I can't say what's happening in 600 years, but I think for the long, long foreseeable future. Things became more difficult the more topics we took up to be brought into this European system of cooperation. We started with coal and steel, and today practically all the fields of economy are covered, and a lot of fields of jurisdiction and so forth. And then we started with 6, and now we are going to be 27, and maybe we are even more in the future. And there, of course, works the basic law of international organizations. The bigger they are, the looser is the contact, the internal link between them. But we went along, and as I said, it is a process, and with that process we will overcome also, I think, the debacle, the event of the refusal of what was called the European Constitution. There will be other ways. I'm very positive. Because one thing is clear, this union is in the interest, in the basic interest of all its members, so they all have an interest to continue. But how about security? And that is an old story. It is an old story because first, within what is today the European Union, we started foreign policy to harmonize already in 1970. And we were and are very successful in all the fields of multilateral policy, in particular within the United Nations, and where policy is made without weapon power. That is the one side. The other side is security policy understood as a policy of the use of weapon power. And there, the story goes much farther back in history than 1970. And you see, in 1950, when the Community for Coal and Steel was founded, the argument was that by this union, the two materials which traditionally in Europe were the necessary materials to wage war, coal and steel for weapons and coal for having steel, was not only an economic initiative and not meant only as an economic initiative, because with the situation which we have today within the European Union, that wars or weapon fights between European states have become unthinkable, a European dream has become true. I say that with that preciseness because we in Europe have, of course, noticed and I think justly evaluated how much the United States, the American people, was vulnerated by 9/11, by the fact that they were attacked on their own soil, and then this great destruction happened on their own soil that never had happened before, with the exception of the War of Independence and the British action of 1824 when they burned the White House. So we understood that, but we in Europe have made that experience to having destruction and death on our own soil, in our own house, for roughly 1500 years. So this is a different approach to weapon policy, and this approach was started in Europe not by politicians, by kings, by dukes. It was started by great spirits. It was started by intellectuals. And the first one who is located wrote in the year 1300 an essay about monarchy. And at that time you had two forces, the Pope and the Emperor, and they fought each other. And he wrote an essay that they should do away with fighting, they should start speaking, they should replace war by negotiation. And the author of that essay was Dante Alighieri, who evidently had some time left when he wrote his gigantic and famous Divine Comedy. And for the following 600 years, you had 100 proposals, essays, studies of that kind, and among the authors, many famous and still well-known ones. I only mention two. I mention the German Immanuel Kant, who wrote about perennial peace, which is considered by many a scholar of political science as being the original source of the idea of the United Nations and of the European Union. Identical ideas for identical approaches to have peace secured. And the other author wrote about actual and future peace in Europe, an essay in 1692, and his name was William Penn, who wrote that 10 years after King George of Britain had given him that piece of land, which today is Pennsylvania, as you know. And in the first half of the 20th century, another 70 studies and initiatives, also political, civic initiatives, started in the same direction, having a world order in which the use of weapon power is limited as much as it can be. And I might remind you that in the early centuries, until the 17th century roughly, for the European, Europe was not a continent among other continents. It was the world. What Dante, what Kant thought and wrote down was a perception of the world, was a proposal for world politics. Europe was the world. The other parts were either not discovered yet, or they were so far away that they had a kind of a mythical fairy tale appearance for Europeans. So this is what the grounds are, what the basis is for European security policy thinking. And this is why Europeans react to use of weapons sometimes in their own way. We have then introduced security policy use of weapons in 1992 with the Treaty of Maastricht, the treaty by which the European Union, as it is today, was founded. But it showed that the systems which I had, with that voting example mentioned, they certainly do not work when security and the use of military power is concerned. So we have still a intergovernmental cooperation within the European Union, which also allowed that split after 9/11, not only the split in NATO, also the split in the European Union. But this cooperation is based on the other kind of cooperation, so is of a specific character. And in 2003, the fall of 2003, the European Union drafted and agreed upon a simple strategy of 3 points. First, the security policy of the European Union is aimed at security and stability, security in the larger sense of that notion, in the area around the European Union. Means stability, economic and political stability included. Second, it is the policy of the European Union to foster, to participate, to strengthen every effort of multilateral security policy in the world, and of course, in the first place, within the system of the United Nations. And third, we Europeans, according to that strategy, to be aware of what is called in that document the new challenges, and that of course includes the challenge which is actually in the foreground of interest, terrorism. And let me put in at this moment, perhaps, because I'm sure you are going to ask about that right away, a few words about the German policy. Germany has said no to participation in the war against Iraq. And this no was based on a 85-90% approval of the population of Germany. And I might add, I have the impression gathered during my stay in your country last year, practically at the same time, and now, that Americans are not completely aware of what had happened on the eve of the war against Iraq in Europe. We had never before such mass demonstrations in practically all great cities of the European Union as we had at this moment against that war. And you know, some successions, Spain had a change of government, Tony Blair is in difficulties, and so forth on. So this was not a political decision on one problem and where's the next one. This was an attitude based on a large consensus of the population. And by that, I think I conclude and can tell you what you want if you have questions. And I would be interested to hear from you what you have as opinion, because that, you always can learn. That would interest me, and I could also tell you some things which I do not say now, because we want to have first now the English-speaking period, and then we go on. I see the time is running out a little bit. So thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for anything you want to say, to ask, to mention.